A third piece of legislation that I think is quite interesting and again shows this sort of regenerative thinking is a piece of legislation called the Gregory Clause, which is implemented in a series of poor law reforms, again in 1847. Now, essentially, this provision excluded tenants who held more than 1/4 acre of ground from entering the workhouse unless they first conceded possession of their land. In other words, paupers had to relinquish their farmlands and their homes in order to get government assistance from this point on. Essentially, this turned a famine policy, an aid policy, into a charter for land clearance, which wasn't seen as a bad thing if you wanted to get rid of smallholder farmers in particular. And this piece of legislation needs to be seen alongside another piece of legislation called the Encumbered Estates Act. Pressed by Robert Peel in Parliament, these acts in 1848 and 49 were designed to assist the sale of insolvent estates and force the eviction of profligate landlords. It was felt that Irish landlords hadn't done Ireland any service, so we need to get rid of them. And the legislation is quite interesting. It places the duties of the Act beyond sort of normal legal mechanisms. The jurisdiction for these encumbered estates courts was actually in the hands of the Court of Chancery, which is just the decision of 3 elected commissioners and so on, which is kind of interesting because this sort of social interventionism actually flies in the face of the free market mantras that a lot of these reformers actually subscribe to. But actually the end point of this is really to point out that it was felt that this sort of legislation would unlock the field of industry in Ireland, as Trevelyan said, and it also led to a lot of redistribution of land. About 20 million acres were sold under the aegis of this encumbered estates court. Another piece of legislation known as the Rate in Aid is quite interesting. It made all Irish poor law unions taxable for the relief of the poorest unions, which were those unions in the west of Ireland. And it also made Irish unions responsible for the loans that the British government had given to Ireland up until that point. Now, nationalist response to this is quite interesting. It reaches kind of fever pitch during this period of the famine. An example of that would be the sort of language of Isaac Butt, an economist and lawyer, who said, "When a calamity falls upon us, we recover our separate existence as a nation just so far as to disentitle us to state assistance. If Cornwall had been visited by the scenes that have desolated Cork in the south of Ireland," he continued, "would similar arguments have been used?" Now, George Nichols could only agree that this bill violated the civic principle of one part of the United Kingdom coming to the aid of another. But he thought that the policy was nonetheless necessary if the Irish were to relinquish their old habits. The repeated failures of the potato blight, he said, caused apprehensions as to the perpetuity of the burden, and it seemed to point to the necessity of compelling the Irish to abandon their treacherous potato, which it was thought that they would hardly do so long as they turned to England for help whenever it failed. The rate in aid was calculated to affect this object, and by casting the consequences of the failure entirely upon Ireland itself, which in such case would be unable to persist in its reliance upon a crop so treacherous and uncertain as the potato. So the language is incredibly frank and clear, it seems to me, here. Now, generally, as the famine wears on, this sort of tendency to blame the victim and to appeal to using famine aid as a means to socially engineer becomes more common and less controversial. Now, I could give lots of examples of this. Lord Palmerston says, it's useless to disguise the truth that any great improvement in the social system of Ireland can occur without this sort of transition from small holdings to larger holdings. Charles Wood, who's the Chancellor for the Exchequer, said something similar. John Ashworth, an Englishman who visited Ireland, talks about the elimination of small holdings and handing those farms over to, the language is very interesting, a new race of occupants who should immigrate to Ireland. So it's seen as kind of clearing the ground for a new kind of plantation policy, almost returning to early modern sort of colonial plantations here. Now, of course, this sort of language was challenged by nationalists who were writing in Ireland. So James Fintan Lalor said the small occupier is a man who ought not to be existing. You know, this was the sort of sense that he got from reading government policy on Ireland. Or Hugh Doreen, who was a farmer in North Donegal, he made the point that the word eviction, he said, was the best understood word in the English language. It was understood by young and old who didn't have a second word of English. That's how common these sorts of policies were. But I want to just sort of skip past these, if I can, to conclude really with where in light of these sorts of claims, and I guess these sorts of counterclaims, how do we assess the question of culpability? Whose fault is famine? An interesting way of thinking about this is to use the writings of the legal scholar David Marcus. And he identifies 4 degrees of famine-ogenic behavior. Apologies for the awkward language. Essentially, behavior that aids or abets famines, that makes famines more likely. And he says the 4th degree of behavior is the least deliberate. It involves incompetent or hopelessly corrupt governments who are faced with a food shortage and really aren't able to do anything about it. 3rd degree behavior is sort of indifference. Governments are sort of impervious to the fate of their populations. They could do certain things, but they don't really want to. 2nd degree famine-ogenic behavior is defined as overt recklessness. So governments either enforce or continue to pursue policies that engender famine, that make famine more likely. And finally, 1st degree is deliberate, is intentional. Governments use hunger as a tool of extermination. To annihilate troublesome populations. Now, I think this is a useful way because we sort of get the difference between what's sometimes called acts of omission and sort of the sort of acts of commission and sins of omission is the sort of popular language around this. And actually, the both types can be tremendously violent. But how do we relate this to British famine policies in Ireland? Well, it seems to me that the government's decision to implement certain kinds of famine relief policies and not others can be situated in this sort of typology. The government could have put an embargo on food exports. It could have banned the use of grain for the distillation of alcohol. It could have implemented wage adjustments to help populations through employment and so on. But it didn't do any of these things. And those things that it did do, like establish food depots for the direct distribution of food, price support schemes, public works in other words, and so on, these could have been done with greater magnanimity. They could have been done with greater effectiveness and a greater willingness to save lives. Definitely more could have been done if those in power had attached more significance to the lives that were lost. But this isn't the end of the matter, it seems to me, because we shouldn't just look at what the government did to help the poor, but also the sorts of things, acts of official conduct that make starvation deaths more likely to occur in the first place. And here one could talk about, well, why did we have so many people living on a subsistence diet almost exclusively on potatoes? And one would have to go back and look at the generation of vulnerability through colonial famine policies. But also, I think, one would have to look at the sorts of language we've just been talking about. The sense that for many officials that famine was actually a way to accelerate socioeconomic change. In other words, we're very much here in second degree sort of famine-ogenic behavior. I think it's demonstrably the case that many government officials were behaving in an extremely reckless manner and viewing sort of these schemes of social improvement as an acceptable sort of policy. So what are the lessons today? Well, I don't really have much time to conclude, and I'm very conscious that I've already gone over time. But it seems to me that this policy of blaming the victim is very much sort of present in development discourse today. It's still too easy to blame the poor and their libidinal impulses, their animal impulses for having too many children, or their out-of-date subsistence practices. It's still too easy to talk about grand plans that are going to bring modernity to the global south, and consequently not to talk about other pathways to social and economic development. And most importantly, it seems to me that orthodox development thinking still focuses on this sense of hapless victims and enlightened saviors. So it allows us to think much better of ourselves than we ought to. If we're constantly thinking of our next plans to bring people to eliminate small holdings, we're not really talking about actually policies that directly inhibit poorer populations' ability to subsist. So we're not talking about the common the CAP, or we're not talking about the policies of agribusinesses. We're not talking about the expansion of commercial farms and what that does to livelihood practices in sub-Saharan Africa. We're essentially seeing ourselves as sort of saviours to eliminating the sort of underdevelopment of these places. So it seems to me, as in the past, improvement is an ideology that sort of legitimizes a great deal of violence. Okay, thanks very much.
That was a wonderful talk, David. Thank you very much indeed. It was really most enlightening, and I think the parallels between the Irish famine and what's going on today are very plain. Actually, I think I would put more of what's going on now. I've been in development economics for quite a long time into the second degree category, because I think the huge amount of money that it's been made out of prescriptive advice to the so-called underdeveloped countries is one of the big pushing things, and I guess the same in Ireland, but maybe we could have some more questions about that as we go. Would you like to take questions one by one, or...